Well, good morning, councillors, and to our staff, to our guests in the gallery and those joining us on live stream. Welcome to this April ordinary meeting of the Sunshine Coast Regional Council. To commence, I'd ask the chamber to be upstanding as I invite Councillor Joe Natoli to acknowledge the Traditional Custodians.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On behalf of Council, I would like to start by acknowledging the Traditional Custodians of the Sunshine Coast local government area. We recognise that these have always been places of culture, spiritual, social and economic significance. The Traditional Custodians' unique values and ancient enduring cultures deepen and enrich the life of our community. We commit to working in partnership with the Traditional Custodians and the broader First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to support self-determination through economic and community development. Truth-telling is a significant part of our journey. We are committed to better understanding the collective history of the Sunshine Coast and the experiences of First Nations people. Legacy issues resulting from colonisation are still experienced by Traditional Custodians and First Nations people. We recognise our shared history and will continue to work in partnership to provide a foundation for building a shared future with the Kabi people and the Yinabara people. We wish to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role First Nations people continue to play within our Sunshine Coast community. Together, we are all stronger.
Thank you, Councillor Natoli. Please remain upstanding as I invite Pastor Lawrence Sueli from the Nambour Christian Church to come forward and read the opening prayer. Thank you, Pastor Lawrence.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, councillors. It's my privilege to open the meeting today in prayer. Let us pray. Father, we are grateful, Lord Jesus, for the role that every councillor here play in our region. We're grateful for the role that every staff member of the council play in our region, from the CEO to the managers and to the staff members. And we do ask, Father, that your blessing will be upon each and every one of them. Your word tells us, God, that all authorities has been given and appointed by you. Every councillors here today have been appointed by you through the people they represent. So I pray this morning for your divine wisdom that surpasses all human wisdom. Wisdom and deep insight to solve issues that might be a bit difficult to solve. Wisdom to plan, wisdom to lead the areas, wisdom to know what to do and what not to do. Wisdom to help people, and wisdom, Father, that will make this region prosper, and every family and every business prosper even more in the Sunshine Coast. I pray, Lord Jesus, your blessing upon every families, upon the councillors, your blessing upon every families, every marriages, and upon their children. And Lord, I ask for your tremendous blessing and your spiritual protection in the name of Jesus upon the people of our region of the Sunshine Coast. And I declare your word over our beautiful, amazing region of the Sunshine Coast, from the hinterland to our cities, from the suburb to suburb, from city to city, that the Lord bless you and keep you, that the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you, that the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Lawrence. Appreciate it. Please be seated. I have an apology from Councillor Cox, and also I'm advised that Councillor Dixon will be 10 minutes late. Councillor Landsberg and Councillor Johnston are joining us via Teams, and I just remind them again that it will be necessary to see their raised hand, either for or against any of the motions as we progress through the agenda. The minutes of the last meeting, the ordinary meeting held on 24 March 2022, have been received and confirmed. Can I have someone to move that, please? Councillor Hungerford, seconded Councillor Law. All those in favour? Councillor Landsberg, I need to see your... Thank you, gotcha. Thank you, that's carried unanimously. There is no mayoral minute. Councillors, I would like to draw to your attention that on the 12th of October 2020, amendments to the Local Government Act 2009 and the Local Government Regulation 2012 came into force. The amendments include the new Chapter 5B which sets out the new legislative requirements for dealing with councillors' conflict of interest in local government matters. And these arrangements will apply to how we manage such matters at today's meeting. So in the event that you have a prescribed conflict of interest or a declarable conflict of interest, please raise that prior to the opening of that item. We have a procedural motion today that Council allow an introduction of a new item of business into the agenda for the ordinary meeting held on Thursday, 28 April 2022, namely item 8.4 in the Queensland Audit Office first interim management report for the financial year ended 30 June 2022. Can I have someone move that? Councillor Babarowski seconded Councillor Natoli. All those in favour of receipt? That's carried unanimously. Thank you again. That brings us to item 8.1, our first report for this meeting, which is the March 2022 Financial Performance Report. And I invite Isaac Piggerskill to give us a presentation. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Good morning, all. I'm here today to present the March 2022 Financial Performance Report. Our councillors were 3/4 of the way through the financial year, start to get a good look at how our financials are shaping up for this financial year. In terms of March, we have a $99 million operating result, which is favourable to budget of $1.5 million. Our current budget is an operating result of $10 million. We're confident we'll at least achieve that, or if not beat that, for this financial year. In terms of revenues at this time, the holiday parks is for another strong month for March, achieving budget, ahead of budget for the current quarter. Council also received an early grant payment of $1 million for Queensland Reconstruction Authority due to the rain experienced in February. In terms of operational expenditure, we remain within 1% of budget for March. Our capital works program is 59% complete, which is an actual expenditure of $172 million, and our $290 million program. Our core program sits at 58%, which is $97.5 million. Our cash is $257 million at the end of March, and our debt is currently $642.5 million, and it will look to reduce down to $488 at the end of this financial year, with the Palisade payment coming in June. And Council, the recommendation today is to receive and note the report titled March 2022 Financial Performance Report.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Councillor Hungerford, to move. And a seconder, please. Councillor Natoli, thank you. Would you like to open, Councillor Hungerford?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Another excellent result, and I'll add more on that at the end. Council has a positive operating result of $99 million, which is $1.5 million above the current budget as of the 31st of March. As of the 31st of March, $455.9 million operating revenue has been achieved, which is $2.8 million above the current budget. We've received our extra $1 million in grants for the flooding relief, which will greatly aid us in balancing our budget for this year. As of the 31st of March, $356.8 million of the $357.3 million budget year to date has been expended, which resulted in a variance of $440,000. Council's operational expenditure remains within 1% of budget year to date. Excellent position to be in. As of the 31st of March, $172 million, or 59.2% of Council's $290 million capital works program has been financially expended, and our core capital program has progressed to 58.1% of budget, an actual spend of $97.5 million, and that's in our local community. But those figures, considering where we are at this point of the year, shows the difficulties with the higher costs and supply of materials to complete these jobs. So that's a headwind that we've been working on, and I believe that will carry into the next year, a lot of those projects. Corporate major projects have progressed to 66%. And pleasingly, Council's debt at the 31st of March is $643 million, but with the Palisade payment on the 30th of June 2022, that will reduce to $488 million, an excellent result. Now, to achieve what we've achieved this year, when you consider the CPI figures have just come out at 5.1%, for us to achieve that result and have a budget within 1% of parameter shows the strong financial performance we have. And it's a credit to the finance team, but also infrastructure and services, for delivering out there, and shows that we're on track. And I'm sure we can do that into the next year, because I think the challenges are going to be just as great next year, but because we've got focus and control of our expenditure, we've got an excellent result. So I commend you, this is an excellent result.
Thank you, Councillor Hungerford. Any further speakers? Councillor Prey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for you. Just a question. First and foremost, thanks for all the great work you've done, another excellent report, as Ted always says. My question isn't around the holiday parks and the habit that started to create over the last 12 months with the drive market, creating our above expected revenue for the holiday parks. And I'd like to just get a very clear understanding that there's not an expectation that that will roll into the next budget. We haven't raised our expectations for the next year's budget through the holiday parks, knowing and understanding that the drive market may well drop considerably once all the international air flights become open again and people want to start travelling overseas. So can you just be clear with me, Isaac, that the expectation for next year's budget on the holiday parks remains the same?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. So the variance you're seeing is additional revenue above what we expected. We don't then go and raise that for next year, so potentially we could have a similar result next year if we have similar behaviours. But our target budget remains the conservative amount that we have in this year. So.
Okay, thank you.
No further speakers? You'd like to close, Councillor Hungerford? Not necessary. We'll put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. We'll move to item 8.2, the commercial use of community land for high use process. And I invite Nikki Clements to give us a presentation. Thank you, Nikki. Councillor O'Prey.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to declare a conflict of interest that I, Councillor Jason O'Prey, notify that I have a declarable conflict of interest in item 8.2 to be considered at the ordinary meeting today, the 28th of April, due to item 8.2, reference 4.1 and 4.2. These operators, Excel Surf Academy and Marucci Surf School, are long-time friends of mine. In item 8.3, item 8.2 now, reference 8.4, I've received complimentary gift flights from Paradise Seaplanes to a combined value of $1,043. As Excel Surf Academy, Marucci Surf School and Paradise Seaplanes may derive a benefit or a disadvantage by the matter that is subject of Agenda 8.2, I will exclude myself from the meeting and the discussion and the vote is taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Prey. Okay, Nikki, let's have the presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, councillors. This report seeks council endorsement of the 2022 High Use, High Impact Commercial Use of Community Land EOI process. High Use, High Impact permits allow certain businesses on the Sunshine Coast to conduct commercial activities at approved locations. These locations include popular beaches and parks. They promote activation of our open spaces and support local businesses. Activities complement the purpose of community land and include activities such as loan to surf lessons, beach equipment hire businesses and refreshment bans. Current permits expire on the 30th of June 2022. The EOI process was open to existing permit holders and new businesses for 4 weeks from the 15th of November 2021 through to the 12th of December 2021. At the closing of the EOI process, Council received a total of 34 EOIs. There were 4 activities and locations where no EOI was received. Permits are proposed to be awarded for a 3-year period from 1 July 2022 until the 30th of June 2025. Council officers have now completed the assessment of all EOIs. The EOIs were considered by an assessment panel using defined selection criteria, including the applicant's professionalism, their quality of equipment, management of safety, commitments to the community, and existing performance as a permit holder, where the applicant is an existing permit holder. The assessment process has resulted in the following outcomes: 25 businesses being recommended to be awarded permits to operate from the 1st of July 2022 until the 30th of June 2025. This includes 22 existing permit holders having been successful, 1 existing permit holder who has been unsuccessful, and 3 new permit holders are proposed. 4 activities and locations will remain vacant on the basis that no EOIs were received, including jet ski hire at Caloundra, refreshment van at Cambroon, mobile dog washing at Buddina, and refreshment van at Nambour. The outcome of the assessment process, including the recommended applicants, is outlined in Appendix A. For the activities and locations where no EOI has been received, council officers recommend that these opportunities remain vacant and will be available for the duration of the permit period. The vacancies will be advertised periodically on council's website to encourage and invite new applications, and in an effort to provide timely assessment of EOIs received, it is recommended that awarding of permits for vacant activities and locations during the permit period be delegated to the CEO. New applications will be reviewed by an assessment panel in accordance with Council's community land and complementary commercial activity policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Someone prepared to move the report? Councillor Suarez, thank you. And a seconder, please. Councillor Law, thank you. Would you like to open, Councillor Suarez?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I wasn't prepared to move this report, but thank you, Nikki, for the work that you and your team do in assessing these applications and taking on board the feedback from the local councillors and the local businesses and community in making your assessments. I think it's been a very robust process, and I'm happy to support your report, and I hope that my fellow councillors do too. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Suarez. Councillor Law.
Thank you. If I may, just a question in relation to the vacant opportunities. Did they remain vacant due to no applications at all, or that there were applications that didn't meet the required standards?
Through you, Mr Mayor. Those particular vacancies, we did not receive any EOIs for those particular locations, and therefore they will remain vacant on the basis that no EOIs were received.
Okay. Thank you for that. And just to confirm, the period of the tenders subject to being approved today, how long will they last for?
Through you, Mr Mayor, there'll be 3-year permits. They'll be awarded from 1 July 2022 until the 30th of June 2025.
Great, thank you very much. So to speak in favour of the motion, thank you again for the work done to enable these activities to occur across the region. And in the case of the vacancies I'm aware of, I'll support and do what I can to help get those opportunities filled. But for now, and I urge everyone to support this going through today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Law. Councillor Dixon.
Yep. Thank you, Mr Mayor, and my apologies to Councillor Suarez. I was more than happy to move this one. I think we might be getting an amendment or something put up potentially, which I was waiting for. Obviously, this is a very thorough process, and it's great that we keep the politics out of this. This is about a proper process where staff are assessing based on the merit of applicants. It's not about who you know or what you know, it's about what you can do, and everyone gets a fair assessment. I'm fully supportive of the process, and as an aside, I'm hoping to sit down with Councillor Suarez and the staff soon about mobile food vans. Not high use, high impact, but locations in the region where we might like to trial or look at locations where food vans can turn up in, say, Harmony or Palmview and do something on a Friday night or on a weekend, just to support small business. And on that note, I'd encourage people to come forward from the region, because I look at Division 6, whilst not a large geographic division, we've got one high use, high impact. That's actually been filled. It's a food vendor down at the dog park at Buddina, the Buddina Dog Park, and we've got a vacant location for a dog wash. But that shows me there's still so much more room for other activity within Division 6, and I'm just so surprised that people haven't come forward to suggest locations for activities. I'm a huge supporter of small business and people getting a fair go, so I'd encourage you, please come forward. If you've got applications for Division 6, I'd like to hear about locations for the future. Otherwise, I'm very happy with where we are on this process. As a question though, if I can, when would be the next opportunity for residents to submit new locations that we may have not previously considered? What does that process look like, and how would they get in touch with council?
Through you, Mr Mayor, Council's current community land and complementary commercial activity policy does allow for any new activities or new businesses to approach Council at any time for us to investigate the option of including that particular activity as part of this current permit process. And we can go through a council decision to award that and award it in line with the permit period, so until the 30th of June 2025.
Thank you. Councillor Babarowski.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Quick question, if I may. Nikki, would I be right in assuming that these activities aren't the only activities happening in our region? Is it possible for you to just give a quick snapshot of the state process and how residents may well see a commercial activity in a location that isn't a council approval?
Yes. Through you, Mr Mayor. State government also conduct processes or provide permits for particular commercial type tourism operators. An example of that is on the Palmerstone Passage, where the Marine Park permits are available for things like boat hire, also for jet ski hire, etc. We also have other operators on the Malula River and the Maroochy River where the state government awards those permits, where they don't actually require access to council land and therefore don't have a council permit as such.
Okay, no further speakers. Would you like to close? Councillor Suarez? Not necessary. Let's put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, gentlemen and lady. Talking to the gentleman on the screen. Could we have Councillor O'Prey return, please? Come on in, Steve. You're next. Okay, item 8.3, councillors, I'd like to notify you, or as I notified you at the special meeting on the 9th of November 2020, under section 150 EL brackets 3 brackets B of the Local Government Act 2009, I have a prescribed conflict of interest in matters associated with or impacting on the Sunshine Coast Airport, and as such I must not participate in a decision relating to that matter. As you're aware, as President of the Local Government Association of Queensland, I'm an employer representative director of LGIA Super, which holds a 50% interest in the Sunshine Coast Airport through its asset manager, Palisade Investment Partners. The President of the LGAQ has historically been nominated as a Director of the Local Government Superannuation Scheme, and I've held the position of Director of LGIA Super since 1 July 2018. I receive remuneration for this role, and this is noted in my register of interests. Other entities with an interest in the Sunshine Coast Airport are Pinnacle Funds Services Limited as responsible entity for Palisade Investment Partners Diversified Infrastructure Fund number 1, and Perpetual Trust Services Limited as responsible entity for Palisade Investment Partners Diversified Infrastructure Fund number 2. Any decision making by council or council officers on matters associated with or impacting on the Sunshine Coast Airport may be either beneficial or detrimental to the interests of Palisade Investment Partners, LGIA Super and other entities with a shareholding in the Sunshine Coast Airport. Therefore, I will not be participating in the decision relating to agenda item 8.3 today, and will leave the meeting for the duration of the consideration and vote on that item. For completeness, I ask that full details of my prescribed conflict of interest, as notified on 9 November 2020, be included in the minutes of today's meeting. And I'll pass the chair over to the Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Councillor.
I'd like to thank the Mayor for his declaration and just check that there aren't any further declarations. That being the case, I'll invite Officer Stephen Whitby to start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Councillors, this report presents to Council 2 proposed amendments to the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme, one relating to the Airport Environs Overlay and the other relating to site-specific and editorial matters. The amendment relating to the airport environs overlay responds to recent updates to state planning policy mapping for the Sunshine Coast Airport, and the site-specific and editorial matters amendment responds to council resolutions, property-related matters, specific community concerns, mapping anomalies, or reflects existing development approvals. The proposed amendments are a discrete set of amendments which ensure that the planning scheme continues to accurately reflect updated state planning policy and remains current and fit for purpose. In relation to the proposed airport environs overlay amendment, the planning scheme currently includes a series of overlay maps which relate to the Sunshine Coast Airport and the Canberra Aerodrome, as well as an airport environs overlay code and associated planning scheme policy. The state planning policy mapping related to the airport was updated in 2020 and 2021 to reflect the new runway and alignment. The planning scheme is required under planning legislation to reflect updated state planning policy mapping. And it's particularly important in respect to the airport because it's a significant piece of strategic infrastructure, but also because there are important issues of public safety associated with the operation of the airport. It's important to say that this proposed amendment is not a mechanism for amending flight paths. The proposed amendment includes two components. The first one is updating airport environs overlay maps in respect to a number of layers, including things such as the aircraft noise exposure forecast, obstacle limitation surface, public safety area, wildlife hazard zones, aviation facilities and building restricted areas mapping. The proposed amendment also updates the relevant overlay code and associated planning scheme policy to give effect to those changes to the mapping. It is proposed to amend, therefore it is proposed, councillors, to amend the airport environs overlay maps, code and planning scheme policy to be consistent with the state planning policy, state interests and mapping, and that's the recommendation of the report in respect to that particular part of the amendment. In terms of site-specific and editorial matters, it's proposed to amend the zoning of the following specific sites located at Woombai, Pedestrian Springs and Yandina to reflect existing development approvals. Development of these sites has already occurred or substantially progressed in accordance with relevant development approvals given under the superseded planning scheme. It is intended that the planning scheme zoning maps are updated to more accurately and appropriately reflect the existing and intended use of these sites now that they have been built. The proposed amendment also considers the zoning of two council-owned properties, the first being 33 Corn Close, Buddina. In January 2020, council resolved to dispose of this site. The site is currently included in the open space zone and has a site area of approximately 800 square metres. It's not currently utilised as a park and no park assets exist on the site. Existing park facilities are located close by at Buddina Forest Park and the Falls. Under the former planning scheme, this site was included in the neighbourhood residential precinct. It's proposed to amend the zoning of this site to a low-density residential zone, precinct LDR1 protected housing area, which generally reflects the previous residential zoning and the current prevailing zoning in the local area. The second site, which relates to council property matters, is located at 52 and 52A and Marina Avenue, Mooloolaba. Number 52, which is a 644 square metre site, is under council ownership, and 52A, which is a 63 square metre site, was recently disposed of to Unity Water and contains a sewage pump station. In January 2020, council resolved to dispose of this site. Both sites are currently included in the community facility zone, and under the former planning scheme, the site was included in the neighbourhood residential precinct. It's proposed to amend the zone number 52 to the low-density residential zone, precinct LDR1 protected housing area, which generally reflects the previous residential zoning and the prevailing zoning in the local area. Number 52A is proposed to stay with its current zoning, which is a community facility zone, and be annotated for local utility. The proposed amendment also includes changes to the zoning of land related to the Goshawk Boulevard Power Road connection at Buddina. Planning for this road has been in place since the late 1990s. The alignment of this road has now been finalised and has resulted in the need to update the planning scheme zoning to appropriately reflect that alignment. It's proposed to remove the zoning from the road itself and include all of Lot 30 to the north in the limited development zone and all of Lot 31 in the south in the medium density residential zone. This will provide a high level of assurance to the community about the road corridor location and the zoning allocations attributed to this area. In relation to Laverick Crescent Buddina, this amendment has been prepared in response to a recent council resolution. Council resolved in October 2019 to further consider the zoning of numbers 2 to 4 and 6 Laverick Crescent, following the refusal of the development application for an extension to an existing service station. Following further consideration of this matter, it is proposed to include 6 Laverick Crescent in the local centre zone and to amend the local centre zone to provide for a service station to be a potentially consistent use where replacing an existing service station. It's also proposed to amend the zoning of Lot 3 and 31 Laverick Crescent to the east to also include that land in the local centre zone to reflect the current commercial use of those premises. Proposed amendment also responds to a number of community concerns raised in relation to the zoning of land along the northern side of Dual Court and at 22 Dixon Road, Buddina. Following careful consideration of the issues raised, current land uses in the area and land use constraints, it is proposed to amend the zoning of land along Dual Court from the rural residential zone to include it partly in the low density residential zone and partly in the environmental management and conservation zone. No zoning changes are proposed for lots along the western side of Stringy Bark Road. In relation to 22 Dixon Road, Buddina, it's proposed to amend the zoning from the limited development zone to the low density residential zone, precinct LDR1, protected housing area, which is consistent with the prevailing zoning in the local area. It is also proposed to include specific provisions in the local plan code to limit subdivision on this lot to a maximum of 2 lots, which is consistent with the former subdivision approval issued in 2008, but which has since lapsed. The proposed amendment also seeks to remove the Pier 10 and Dewporth Riverside apartments from the Ocean Street Food and Music sub-precinct. This amendment responds to a number of representations received from residents within the apartment complexes who objected to being included in the former precinct and were concerned about the impact on residential uses from intensive entertainment activities. In relation to Smith Street Woolabah, the proposed amendment seeks to amend the maximum building height of 13 and 21 Smith Street from 18 metres to 25 metres to be more consistent with the maximum building height of adjacent land and buildings already constructed. Finally, the proposed amendment also includes changes to the zoning of land included in the Urban Village residential sub-precinct of the Buddina Urban Village. It is proposed to amend the zoning of the highlighted sites from the high density residential zone to the medium density residential zone to be consistent with the maximum building height of 12 metres, which currently applies to these sites. This amendment responds in part to a petition and individual representations received in March 2019 and July 2020. The petition representations also sought a reduction in the maximum building height for particular parts of the precinct from 21 metres to 12 metres and requested a review of provisions relating to the erosion-prone area and not native wildlife, e.g. turtles. It is intended that these matters be considered as part of the preparation of the new planning scheme, and this was a key direction for the Queensland local plan area as part of the recent consultation process undertaken for the new planning scheme project. Further details about the proposed amendments are outlined in attachments 1 to 4 of the agenda report. It is recommended that Council proceed with the proposed amendments to ensure that the planning scheme remains current and fit for purpose. If Council is of a mind to proceed with the proposed amendments as recommended, the next step in the process is for the proposed amendments to undergo the statutory state interest review process and, subject to that process, to then proceed to the process of public consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patey. And my apologies, Mr. Patey. I think I called you Mr. Whitney, and I've only known you for 10 years, so it's a completely understandable mistake.
It's a compliment.
Thank you. So I believe, someone to move, and I believe you have an alternative.
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Toley.
Mr Deputy Mayor, I'd like to move an alternative motion to 8.3 that Council A receives and note the report titled Proposed Planning Scheme Amendments. B, decide to amend the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme 2014, including the planning scheme policies under Section 20, amending planning schemes under Minister's Rules of the Planning Act 2016. C, delegate authority to the Chief Executive Officer to carry out the statutory process to prepare and progress the following amendments in accordance with the Planning Act 2016 and the Minister's Guidelines and Rules 2020. 1. The proposed Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme 2014 major amendments and planning scheme policy amendments, airport environs overlays. 2. The proposed Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme 2014 major amendment, site-specific and editorial matters, subject to also proposing to amend the planning scheme provisions applicable to the area, including the northern eastern section of sub-precinct KAWLPSP 4A of the Buddina Urban Village to include this area in the medium density residential zone from high density residential zone, and to specify a maximum building height of 12 metres from 21 metres and make any necessary consequential amendments to give proper effect to and reflect these changes. D, note that the following public consultation on the proposed amendments and receipt of any submissions, a further report will be presented to Council for formal consideration. A second.
Someone to second? Thank you, Councillor Dixon. Councillor, I might ask the officer, Stephen Payton, to just give your opinion, professional opinion. Are there implications that councillors need to consider before they go for questions or comments? Could you explain what that may mean?
Sure, thank you, Mr Deputy Chair. Look, certainly it's open to Council to propose that change, and there are no specific process constraints that would prevent it at this time. As indicated in the presentation, planning staff had included review of building height for Buddina Urban Village as a key direction for the new planning scheme that recently completed preliminary consultation. That, in our mind, that review most likely would take a broader frame and consider the feedback provided as part of the new planning scheme preliminary consultation program. It's important to just acknowledge that there remains a risk that even if an amendment is made at this time, an existing development approval, which we understand is underway in terms of construction, may be fully utilised and other development applications brought forward either before the amendment takes effect or during the period under which a development application may be made under a superseded planning scheme, which is likely a period of 18 months to 2.5 years. This is not necessarily a reason not to proceed with the amendment at this time or indeed in the future, but it's just an acknowledgement that it cannot provide immediate protection in terms of an outcome of concern, and that to make the change, if development does subsequently occur, we wouldn't want there to be a perception that the change to the zoning gives a guarantee that the existing development approval won't be given effect, or that people won't take up their rights under the existing planning scheme as it currently stands.
Thank you, Mr Patey. So, councillors, any questions, comments? Oh, sorry, you'd like to vote. My apologies. So, Councillor Toe, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. This is obviously an issue for our local community there in Buddina. It's been a very specific issue that during the election campaign was one of the most talked about issue as I door knocked the entire Buddina area. And obviously I had the opportunity to meet with the residents and have meetings with Steve, the representation that was made to ask why the petition hadn't been advanced in terms of a request for a planning scheme amendment. It's important that, through this process, Council acknowledged that there was an issue with the appeal, and until that appeal that the community had against the planning decision was resolved, that we wouldn't advance this. That appeal has now been resolved, and immediately the residents have come back and said, we're ready to go now. We want this planning scheme amendment. It's been in there for 3 years, and we would like it to happen. So as part of this process, this came through. I think there was an indication that councillors were supportive of the petition through the process that we've taken it up until now. I think I anticipated when I first became aware that we were only going to deal with part of the request, the southern part, and not the northern part, that it would be a sense of irritation for our community. And it has. I've received letters, and I think other councillors have received letters of concern and saying, why only deal with one part? You know, we requested the entire northern and southern part to be dealt with, and that will deal with the anomalies in the area and bring it down to medium density and 12 metres. We saw when we dealt with Tillinga Street, Tillinga Street has been approved, it's got 6 years. This will not affect Tillinga Street. It won't have any impact, and the residents know that. And the residents know that it won't stop a developer being able to put an application under the superseded planning scheme. And as Steve mentioned, it could be 18 months, 2.5 years for that to happen. If they lodge in that period of time, 12 months after the actual amendment has been signed off by the state government, they have still 12 months on the superseded plan to still lodge and still be accepted by council. So it doesn't preclude the developer from, or any developer wanting to do that. But I think it's important for us as a council, when we got elected, I think one of the things that came very clear to me was that we wanted to listen to residents and we wanted to represent the community. And I think we did that with Twin Waters West. I think, you know, listening and seeing the agitation that Councillor Praise had in the Ocean Street Food and Music Precinct, we need to understand that sometimes these amendments are necessary to be able to deal with some of the anomalies and some of the issues that the planning scheme will bring up, which isn't always visible when these planning schemes are put together. I think by delaying it by another 2 years, all we're going to do is delay the inevitable. And I think for the community, it'll be a sign of good faith for us to be able to demonstrate to them that we're listening to them. There is a lot of concern in my area about the future planning scheme, about the fact that mass transit has indicated previously that there was going to be high densities. Council made it very clear that it was medium density. We weren't dealing with heights. I think this will be a really good segue in being able to say to the community leading into the planning scheme that we are listening and we want to reflect the type of community that we want to represent. Medium density, low rise, and I think that particular area, you know, the biggest issue that we had dealing with Tillinga and coming back with dealing with lighting issues is that one thing that was evident to me is dealing with lights and the impact on turtles is almost impossible to condition human behaviour. It is impossible, and I think by reducing the height in that precinct will give us some sort of sense of ability to be able to manage the impacts on the turtles as well. So, councillors, I would hope that you'd be able to support the community today. Don't put them through another 2 years. They've asked 2019, I think in March 2019 this request came through. There was about 228 signatures on that petition. I think as a mark of good faith, it would be wonderful to be able to support this alternative motion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Natoli. Well timed. Councillor O'Prey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Just a question, if I may. No talking to the motion as yet. In item D, note the following public consultation on the proposed amendments and receipt of any submissions. A further report will be presented to Council for formal consideration. Through to Steve Patey. Mr. Patey, could you please give me a bit of a guide on the exact, or as close to the exact timelines as you get on each of those elements? So how long will the public consultation take? How long will it be with the state? Once the submissions have been received and we've gone through, Council's had time to go through the submissions, and then by the time that the further report be drafted, how long are we looking at all those dot points? Could you give me a bit of a guide there, please?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Councillor, it's difficult to be definitive about timing in respect to that process because some elements are outside of Council's control. So, for instance, the state interest review can take anywhere from, 3 months to a year, depending on the issues and complexity. We would hope that the whole process would be able to be completed within 12 to 18 months. There is, and it might be 12 months would be probably the optimistic answer. There is a 20-day business day consultation period that needs to be included after state interest review.
So we go to consultation. So we go to community consultation, then we go to the state, then we go to consultation again. Is that correct?
No, slightly different. We go to the state first of all, and the state provides authorisation for council to publicly consult. We carry out the consultation process in accordance with the Act. We then review the submissions that are received, and council decides either to proceed with the amendment, to proceed with it with changes, or not to proceed with it, as the case may be. And then it goes back to the state for what's called a second state interest review before it would then be adopted and incorporated into the planning scheme. So just based on history of these types of amendments, normally 12 to 18 months is a fair estimate.
All right, so as a bit of a guide now, if say I owned a block of land down there and I was looking at developing, but I don't have the funds right now and I want to do it in a couple of years, 2 or 3 years' time, I've got 12 months or 18 months, as you've just said, which takes us from middle of 22 to end of 24. Is that right? And then another year after that.
Correct. The way it sort of works is obviously you can lodge an application under the current planning scheme until the new version of the planning scheme takes effect. I think you've then got 6 months to lodge a request.
6 months.
But then you've got a further 6 months to actually lodge an application. So you've got 6 months to lodge a request to have an application assessed under a superseded planning scheme, and then you've got a further period of time to actually make that application.
So if I'm looking at 2 timelines here with our planning scheme that we're going through at the moment, would it be fair to say it's on level grounds, or is it quicker to wait for the planning scheme?
I don't think, through you, Mr. Chair, I don't think it would be. It's unlikely that it's unlikely that the new planning scheme project would run faster than this amendment because of the small nature of this amendment. So we'd be hopeful that this would take effect. Before the new planning scheme. But we just need to manage those timelines as we go forward with the process. It might be that they coalesce in some way and we end up, the easier path is actually to incorporate things into the new scheme. So we'll just have to see how that state interest review process goes for this amendment, if council are aligned to support the amendment today.
Okay. If I'm a betting man, it won't happen. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Pratt. Councillor Hungerford.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I see this as in part to the petition and recommended for the new planning scheme to deal with the outstanding matters. What concerns me about this is delegate authority to the Chief Executive Officer, and I believe this is more a subsequential motion rather than an alternative motion. It should have come after the substantive motion. To prepare and progress the following amendments in accordance with the Planning Act 2016 and the Minister's Guidelines and Rules 2020. Now the first one, the proposed Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme, Major Amendment and Planning Scheme Amendment, Airport Environs Overlay. That's not telling me what we're proposing is an amendment. Because what we're doing here is, on the 15th of July 2020 and the 3rd of March 2021, the Strategic Airport and Aviation Facilities mapping layers for the Sunshine Coast Airport were updated in the state planning policy. Local government is responsible for ensuring its planning scheme continues to accurately reflect those state mapping layers. That's all we're doing here. Reflecting what's already in the state mapping layers. It's straightforward. What further amendments being proposed here, I want to understand. In that number 1 there, proposed major amendment in planning scheme policy amendment airport environs overlay. What's being proposed? What are the changes?
You appreciate that that's
the question I'm asking.
That's
because
not Councillor Natoli's part of the amendment. You may want to ask that more broadly.
He's taken that out, but we're not going to have any further amendments there because that's what it actually says.
Right.
It's confusing. So why is that in there if it's no different to what we're doing at the moment?
Do you want to
But see, it should be a subsequent motion dealing with the things you want to change. So it's only, and here it should be noted, proposed airport environs overlay amendment is not a mechanism to amend the flight paths for the Sunshine Coast Airport. So we've got that, again, that this is only reflecting what the state mapping has in there at the moment. There's no further changes being proposed. Because when you read that, you can read it two different ways.
Right. Do you want the officer to give you some assistance in understanding the implications?
Thank you, Mr Deputy. So the proposed amendment in respect to the airport, the detail of that amendment, Councillor, is set out in attachment 2 to the agenda report. So there's quite a bit of detail in there about the wording and mapping changes. And so there's two components to this proposal. One in respect to the airport and the changes in respect to the site-specific and editorial matters, which is the second part of the amendment, is set out in attachment 4 to the agenda report. And I believe that Councillor Natoli has sought to add an additional matter to be considered as part of that second package of amendments, if I can explain it that way.
I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
There's no further changes there because someone in the community could read into that when we've all had emails on things there. I wanted to clarify, that's why I'm asking Dorothy Dixon to clarify that point.
Thank you.
Now, what concerns me with this one here is, this next one, is making that further amendment. What concerns me is the staff have quite adequately said that should be considered in the new town plan. Because what concerns me here is we're going to have two processes running parallel to each other, the new town plan and doing this other amendment. It's got a statutory process there. That is going to cost staff time, cost, resources that could be better put into the new town plan. Could I get an indication of what sort of resource drain that would be on the staff when they should be concentrating on the new town plan?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Chair. I don't think it would be a significant drain, Councillor, and I only say that because the proposal is to progress with an amendment anyway that includes two components, so this would be one additional element of that. Yes, there'd most likely be additional submissions that would have to be reviewed, I suspect, and taken into account. But in terms of the overall context of the amendment, it's probably not substantial, if I can describe it in that way. We'll have to wait and see how many submissions we actually receive, I think, to understand what the full consequences are.
The point I'm trying to make there is it will impact on resources that will be better used on the town plan, because that's going to be a drain on their staff there. The other one is people who established before have 6 months to lodge their intent and then lodge applications. Regardless of which point you come in here, that provision rose. I've had that in Buddina when we amended in 2014 and took out duplexes. There were 70 odd of those lodged their intent. Some of them are only just being finished today. This doesn't solve that problem at all. I believe, and I'm asking the staff there, is it better to make this as part of the town plan or bring it in what's only going to be 6 months or 12 months earlier at best, if we're lucky, because they're both going to come in not far from each other. This amendment and the town plan looking at being gazetted. So what gain is there really there?
Through you, Mr Chair. I think there's a couple of issues going on there. One is as I sort of indicated, when staff looked at Buddina Urban Village and building heights more generally in that area, we'd probably take a broader reference or broader frame in the new planning scheme that would deal with more than just this area. So what that potentially means is that the new planning scheme might do another thing. So it's just those. It's a bit awkward, if I can describe it, having these amendments run the way they are in terms of interaction with the new planning scheme. But I also acknowledge that the risks of development happening, are risks that exist irrespective of whether it's the new planning scheme or a scheme amendment. And whichever way council decides to go, we'll just need to clearly convey to the community how that any amendment or any change to the planning scheme in areas like this, isn't an ironclad guarantee that development won't happen consistent with what the current planning scheme says and has said for the last decade or more.
So, Councillor Hankford, I can check with you that they were in the nature of questions. You haven't spoken to it yet?
No, I haven't spoken to it yet, but I will speak to it now. I will not be supporting this because it's ad hoc. We're doing a detailed planning process. We went through a lot of work on this. We had the petition. We're answering the things in there we can at the moment, but there's a lot more, like Mr Patey has said. There's more going to be considered in the town plan than just this. This will be one of the suite. And I believe this is better off being done inside the town plan. because it's more holistic, and I think this, in my opinion, doesn't really show a real comprehension of the planning process and getting the best result out of it. And distracting staff time on a minor thing on the side that it can be dealt with in the major context of the town plan plus other matters. I believe that's the better way of doing our planning. Doing things ad hoc and on an individual basis on a process, we've got to go to the state interest check, community check, come back again. All of that's got to be done with the town plan as well. Let's not have two processes running. We should only have one process because that's more efficient. So I really think there should have been a subsequential motion after the major one rather than amending and muddying the whole motion. That's the way it should have been done. But I will not be supporting this and ask councillors not to, and I'll be quite happy to move the officer's recommendation should this not get up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hungerford. Councillor Dixon.
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. I've seen some pretty intense planning changes proposed since we adopted the planning scheme in 2014. This is not one of them in terms of the suite of packages that the staff report to us. This is administrative, and actually credit to Councillor Hungerford. He's brought forward a lot of sites in his division, which I previously had some custodianship over, which need to be fixed up, and I'm glad he's done that. I'm going to make particular note of a site that Ted and I, Councillor Hungerford and I, went up to in Buddina. Ted, I think it was King Street. I'm hoping it's King Street, the service station. Councillor Hungerford and I met with the service station owner. We understand there's a push from the state member and the community through a petition to look at the site, which is great to see that staff are following up on that. We made some promises that we'd do that work. That work has been done, and that's credit to the staff and Councillor Ted. Also, the areas around the extension of Gosford Boulevard. So, for those who don't know, Council has been working on since probably the year I started in Council, or even before, 2006, to deliver a brand new roadway from Buddina, from Stringy Bark Road through to Power and Dixon Road. And Councillor Hungerford's been working on that pretty hard. We've gone in and we've bought the land, we've paid for that. We've done some planning around it, and today we're actually formalising some more no-go areas for development where you can't develop, and also some other areas where you can. I guess the key for residents there is that they now know what that road alignment looks like. They know it's purchased, the land's there. We're working hard on actually getting the capital expenditure to build the road. That's something we're going to do soon. But they actually understand the planning now. They know that the sensitive environmental areas around their estate in the Springs will not be cleared. They know that the trees will be protected. There will not be residential development encroach on the environmental areas. It's very clear. And if you listen to some of the people in the community, they think that myself and Councillor Hungerford are out there to clear swathes of trees for road upgrades. Today proves the point that we're not. In fact, we're actually shutting down development opportunity in the area on the northern side of this road proposal. So it's locked up. Essentially, you keep the environmental corridor. So credit to Councillor Ted on that. Councillors, the package today, it's a no-brainer. I understand why we would be doing what we're doing, but the real kicker for me here today is probably a question for Mr Patey. Let's make no bones about Councillor Joe's intent. He's representing the local issue that I've heard every year non-stop this term. I get the issues, I've seen the emails, I've met with the residents in the area, I've lived through this Buddina urban village with Councillor Connolly when he was the local councillor. We even had mass transit recently, and I know I voted against the mass transit, particularly around issues with the overhead wires and light rail. I understand the community's concerns, I get that. Councillor Natoli's just trying to echo those thoughts here in the planning today. So my question for Mr Patey is, what are the implications of us putting that urban village all into one hit now, given that there's people in this room, myself included, who aren't completely confident that we understand the implications and ramifications of making wholesale change to the whole urban village in one go now, without going through a full detailed planning scheme amendment, a total package to exhibit, show people what the heights look like, show them the densities. Tell me what I'm going to miss out on in terms of community engagement if I just go with the amendment today instead of waiting for a full planning scheme change. I know there's a lot there, but the point I'm trying to make is it best to give the full community the opportunity to look at everything, understand the whole package, instead of just taking these piecemeal bites out of the urban village. A lot there, but I'd like your thoughts.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Chair, I would say that, like any planning issue, there are different stakeholders with different interests here, and we've certainly heard from a number of the community who have concerns about the height limits in this particular locality. We've probably heard less from the directly affected landowners in this precinct, or all of them, and that's something that certainly the key directions in the planning scheme about looking at a review of heights more generally was seeking to draw out, I guess. So, on the one hand, council may not get the benefit of that preliminary consultation and what that reported on. On the other hand, there's no doubt that there is strong local community sentiment here, from what we understand, around heights in this area. So I think it's a really vexed issue. It's likely that we'll have more sophisticated ways in the new planning scheme project of demonstrating change. So what's there existing versus what's likely to occur, and that might elicit a more thorough community engagement process. But I think it's really a question of how important council considers it is to move with an amendment of this nature at this time.
So if I can, just to close on this, I'll make the points very, very clear. I'm extremely sympathetic to this issue, and I know I've referenced mass transit, but that really just shows the rubber hitting the road in terms of my position. So I'm on that journey, and I'm hearing from those residents, and I can't make a decision today based on a future planning scheme amendment. I can't set myself up like that, but I would be sympathetic to say that I understand what their concerns are, and when we do fully revisit this area, I will be looking at taking some of those heights down in my personal view, because I get the journey, I understand the concern. What I am worried about here today is, whilst Councillor Natoli is doing everything that I would be doing if I was in his shoes in that area, I think it's a little bit premature. I think we haven't heard from enough of the residents, although we understand their views on it. I understand the petitions have come in the vicinity of around 200 plus, and I would expect, given the size of this issue and the magnitude of political discussions and newspaper stories in previous years gone by, we would have heard a lot more on this. And I think Mr. Patey's idea of getting out, showing the height, showing what things are going to look like, actually showing the bulk and scale in a planning scheme amendment, is going to elicit more community feedback and response. And I think that's exactly what Councillor Natoli needs in this chamber today. My read of the room is this may not get up. I'd like to see this go through a more formal process where we can actually engage more thoroughly with the residents and show them the respect that they deserve, because they've told us they've got a problem. Let's show them the respect that they deserve, engage fully on this and do this as one package together. I know I didn't want to foreshadow a future vote, but I would be very sympathetic to helping residents in this area, given what I know. On that note, I can't support the amendment here today or what's been proposed as the motion. I would be supporting the officer's original recommendation. But it's important for people to hear where I stand on this. And again, the word that I've used today is very sympathetic to the issue, and I can appreciate why Councillor Joe's doing this.
Thank you, Councillor Dixon. Councillor Suarez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess some of the arguments made this morning, you could argue that we may as well not do any of these proposed planning scheme amendments and wait for the planning scheme. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Patey, is why are we bringing these proposed amendments forward at this time? I feel I know the answer, but I'd just like to hear it from you.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Chair. Look, certainly, maintenance of the planning scheme, no matter how old it is an important part of our responsibility when we've got a fast-growing local government area. So we've made a number of amendments to this planning scheme, I think over 20 now since it commenced in 2014. And I think we also indicated to Council that amendment program would continue until the planning scheme reaches an end and we have a new scheme. So yes, on the one hand, certainly Council could form a view that it's not doing any more amendments. I would just... My advice to Council would be is I think it's important to keep the scheme up to date. We know as a matter of legal principle that's important. There are a number of matters that have been brought to Council's attention, some of the amendments that we've got incorporated here are actually quite old, so they're 3 or 4 years old. So yeah, that's why it's important to continue, in our view, to support and amend the planning scheme so that it stays up to date.
Thank you. Follow-on question from that then is, in response to the feedback from the community and understanding what the issues were, why is this proposed planning scheme amendment only consider reducing the height in the southern portion and not the northern portion?
There's actually not a reduction in height in those, sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, there's actually not a reduction in height. What we're doing is aligning the zoning allocation. So the way we anticipated organising this amendment was to deal with those things that removed what we saw as being inconsistencies in the scheme. So there's currently a situation where you've got high density residential zones but low height limits. So what the amendment seeks to do is to change those areas that were in the high density residential zone but had a 12-metre height limit and draw them back to the medium density residential zone. So there's a strong alignment between what the zoning is saying and what the height is allowing for. So that was one part of, as I understand it, the petition was to get that alignment, and the second part was this actual change to height and zoning in particularly the northern part of the Buddina urban village to reduce the zone from the high density residential zone to the medium density residential zone, and to reduce the height from 21 metres to 12 metres in height.
So I'm not quite clear, so why, if that was brought to us from the community via the petition, why has that northern precinct not been changed with the zoning as well from high to medium?
Through you, Mr. Chair, as I said, so that component of it, in respect to those changes to height and zoning in that particular area, were thought of to be sort of better addressed as part of a holistic planning scheme review because they were more material changes, whereas just doing the alignment to zones and to zones to match the existing height limits wasn't a substantial change. So what we tried to do with the amendment packages moving forward is keep them as contained as possible to the issues. And we had in view or had in mind a broader review of height limits in Buddina Urban Village. I know there's some other areas apart from this particular node where there might also be justifiable case for some change, and the question is whether that review and any subsequent changes happen in a series of steps or it happens once as part of the new scheme.
Okay, so final question. In terms of timing, if this amendment were to be adopted and if this intention were also to be adopted in the new planning scheme, what's the time difference between this coming through and a new planning scheme being adopted that may reflect the same outcome?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's difficult to be definitive about that once again. You know, Council's indicated that it's keen to get a planning scheme in effect in 2024. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that this amendment might take effect sometime in 2023, depending on how the statutory review process goes. It's unlikely to be this year, so I would have a high level of confidence that next year this amendment might take effect.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Councillor Suarez. Councillor Law.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Deputy Chair. A couple of questions, first of all. With the questions we've heard so far, I think I've heard what I need to hear about the amendment that Councillor Joe has put up, and some very interesting comments around that. I'd just like to ask a couple of other questions about the amendments before I go back to the amendment. With the changes to the Ocean Street food and entertainment area, if we remove that portion of the current zoning, are there any businesses located in that area that will be harmed by this change of zoning?
Through you, Mr. Chair, not to my knowledge. There was formerly a restaurant operating in one of those blocks of units, but I don't think that restaurant operates anymore. So, from my understanding, no, that there's unlikely to be any businesses that take advantage of those provisions that would be adversely affected by this change.
Okay. Should it turn out that there is in fact someone there because we
point
don't...
of order?
Mr Chair. Sorry, David. Sorry, Councillor Law. Is this process in the meeting supposed to be just speaking to the proposed amendment presented by Councillor Natoli, and should it be adopted or refused, then we discuss and debate the entire report?
The issue is that if this doesn't go ahead, you'd have an opportunity to prosecute the arguments of the original officer recommendation. But if, as this is the live motion, it may be voted on and it closes down that debate. So I think what Councillor Law's trying to do is make sure that his issues are covered.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just needed that clarification because I have some other matters that I'd like to ask some questions on that are separate to the amendment that Councillor Natoli has put
So I would do that. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. Carry on, Councillor Law.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. So, because this goes to consultation, there is an opportunity that if there is someone who is there that we're not aware of, they would have an opportunity to come back and say, hey, actually, I've got my business here, I wish to continue. And that would be heard, and we would listen very carefully to those issues and matters and objections.
Through you, Mr Chair. That's correct, Councillor.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Next question is in the Yandina changes. Now, I understand that we're bringing into line approvals that were made in old planning schemes. We're bringing them to reflect proper zoning for what has now actually been approved and happened on the ground. What I just want to be really clear of is the portions that have been set aside for environmental conservation. Forgive me if that's not quite the right wording, but are those now going to be absolutely securely contained within this amendment? Because I'm aware of, prior to my involvement, the community were very, very determined to make sure that the development on particularly one of those sites was kept to a minimum to protect the original stands of timber there.
Through you, Mr Chair. That's correct, Councillor. So in respect to those areas, the proposal is that the areas that aren't intended to be developed would be included in the Environmental Management and Conservation Zone, which reflects the development approvals and the negotiations that occurred as part of those.
Yeah, great, thank you. Coming back to the amendment that's been put up by Councillor Natoli, when I look at the package of amendments, I've counted that there are 13, and the Buddina issues is one of those 13. So to make the small adjustment to one of those 13 amendments and editorial changes, it's actually not a substantial piece of work to do that. Would that be correct?
Through you, Mr Chair, that would be correct.
Okay. So to say that we can't support this amendment based on a whole range of additional work and so on is actually fairly inaccurate, because that work would still happen. If this amendment is defeated, that work still must happen if the other recommendation is approved. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr Chair. Yeah, perhaps as I sort of indicated earlier, that there is already an amendment package on foot if Council supports this, which would need to be progressed. This addition is unlikely to add significant additional work, but it is another point of interest. It's likely or not unlikely that it might attract submissions, and they would have to be dealt with. So it's just within that context that there might be some additional work involved.
Okay, thank you. And final question on that matter. So from this point we go to approval to go to public consultation. That consultation could give us another indication of what landowners and businesses want to occur in that space. So we could end up with this being part of the final package that goes to the Minister for approval.
Through you, Mr Chair. Correct. If this proposal put forward by Councillor Natoli is included in the final amendment package, then that will be something that people will be able to make submissions about.
If it's not successful and we return to the officer's recommendation and it goes forward, could it not still come out through the proposal for this area that we should in fact end up with what this proposal is through that consultation process?
Through you again, Mr. Chair. Look, certainly that issue might be ventilated. It couldn't be dealt with then as part of this amendment because this amendment package would deal just with the matters that were incorporated within it. It would be a matter that, you know, is dealt with as part of the new planning scheme project.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Final question, if I may, for Councillor Ntoli. Do you happen to have the wording of the petition with you today?
I don't.
Okay, not to worry. That's all right. No, it's all good. So no further questions, Deputy Mayor. Given what I've heard and what I'm seeing is really just rather a reflection of what the community sentiment has been certainly in the past 2 years and by the sound of it possibly for a lot longer. I'm going to want to support the inclusion of this amendment and I will support the amended motion today and would encourage others to be able to take on what we've heard from the community, what came through in their petition. And while Councillor Joe has only had this current term to be able to take on those community influences and wish to represent them here, what I think I've heard from longer term councillors, Councillor Hungerford and Dixon, is you've had the opportunity to work with your community to achieve this amendment package over quite a considerable number of years. And I think that if the community believes, and if Councillor Ntoli and his community believes that we've actually missed something out of this amendment that should come through now, I'm very satisfied with what I've heard and what I've read through the reports that we should support that today. And I would encourage you, the amount of additional work is minimal, we've heard that, because there are 13 other minor amendments, editorial amendments, that will be going out to public consultation. So all of that work will happen. And if that's the reason that you're not supporting this amendment, just because, oh, there's going to be a lot of extra work, well, that's not the reason, because then you would also not be supporting section C2, CII. You couldn't possibly support that in the officer's recommendation if that's the reason you're not supporting it now, because of all this extra work. So I am satisfied to support the amendment that Councillor Ntoli has put forward, and I would urge you, even though you may have said and spoken one way, that you might just want to reconsider that. Given the time period that Councillor Joe has had to work on this with his community, I have a strong sense the community have been talking in support of this for far longer than the past 2 years. So I'll be supporting it, and I actually urge others to support this through at this stage.
Thank you, Councillor Law. Councillor O'Prey.
Mr. Chair, another question if I may. I still may need to talk on the issue. So my question is in and around meeting procedure and potentially standing orders in regard to a councillor bringing forward an alternative motion, as Councillor Ntoli has brought forward here in 8.3. It's my understanding, Mr. Chair, that an alternative motion is something that is rather the opposite of what is going to be debated and discussed, rather than bringing something that is to be included into something that is to be debated and discussed. So, for example, in this instance of the councillor's recommendation, the officer's recommendation, it's about making amendments to the planning scheme and sending them off to the state. The alternative motion is not the opposite of that. In fact, it's just adding. It's an amendment. It's, even as Councillor Ted said before, it's a subsequential motion. And I think that's something that's adding to a little bit of confusion today to our debate and discussion, as Councillor Maria was a little uncertain on whether she should talk to the motion right now, which is a little bit unsettling after 2 years. And I think that the councillor, and tell me if I'm wrong, Madam CEO, but if the councillor has been 2 years in the job, should have a very clear understanding of what the difference is between an alternative motion and an amendment to the motion. Right? I think it is confusing. It's actually confusing for me as well, because I would like to speak to the Ocean Street precinct. Now I have to make a decision on whether I talk about it now, which is really nothing. We should be only debating the red writing, right, in the first instance. Or do I have to wait, or do I roll my bet? Do I hedge my bets? Do I talk now? Do I talk again later? All right, this is about the meeting procedure. I don't think it's clear, and I think the councillor needs a little bit more direction, please. So tell me if I'm right or wrong on that.
Thank you very much, Councillor O'Prey. So, Megan, I think... Would you like to provide some advice?
Through Mr Deputy Chair. Basically, it could have gone either way. So if Councillor Natoli had not moved the motion, the alternate motion at the start, then he could have moved an amendment at a later point. So right now, this is the live motion, and all councillors have the opportunity to speak to that motion in its entirety as it is now. If this motion is unsuccessful, then the officer recommendation, the original motion, can be debated and once again. But as the Deputy Mayor indicated before, if this motion is successful and you haven't spoken to it, say on your Ocean Street precinct, then you wouldn't have the opportunity again.
Does that help clarify that?
Yeah, it's hedging bets, and it's hedging bets. It's not the right way to do it in this chamber that we've done for many, many years.
Appreciate your concern,
and it does create.
Yeah. I think we've clarified, and hopefully for everybody now, that this, because of the timing, is the live motion, and you should debate the recommendation in entirety. So if you do have any unresolved questions or issues, please take the opportunity to do so, not just the red writing. If it's unsuccessful, we do circle back to the officer recommendation. You could re-prosecute your arguments or questions, but it would probably be unlikely that you'd feel it's needed to. But just make the assumption that you should address the resolution in its entirety.
I'm going to give a very clear example of how this is all wrong, because right now I'll speak to the Ocean Street precinct, this will get knocked on the head, and then I'll have to speak to the Ocean Street precinct again. So with that, Mr Chair, I'd like to speak to the motion.
Please do.
All right. And I'll be brief because I know I'm going to be going through this again. The Ocean Street precinct is a wonderful, wonderful example of the council officers just jumping to attention and doing a great job and responding to the community's requests and requests from my office. So this is a great example of what can happen through planning scheme amendments, and I support planning scheme amendments at every level, and as Steve Patey said, it's part of our legal obligation to make sure that we maintain and look after our planning scheme on regular basis, and I agree with this, and I just want to congratulate the planning staff, as I did at Agenda Review, and say what a fine job that they've done in getting all this forward to us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pray. Councillor Natoli? Presumably you're not...
Just a question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mr Patey, in the past, major planning scheme amendments have been put forward outside of the major new planning schemes. I think Twin Waters West was a major planning scheme amendment. I think Segasui, there was major planning scheme amendments. ARIA development in Mooloolaba. So there's significant changes that have happened, and there's probably many more that have gone before that.
Probably a simple answer.
Through you, Mr Chair. Yeah, that's correct, Councillor. And indeed, this, for the purposes of legislation, this amendment that's on the table for council consideration is categorised as a major amendment.
Happy with that, Councillor Suarez.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. I have some questions about other areas of the report, particularly with the airport environs overlay amendment. I sought further information regarding section 8.2.2.2 in the purpose and overall outcomes of the airport environs overlay code to include reference to the local aviation industry, and I received your response which talks about the Maroochy and North Shore local plan code, that would be a sufficient mechanism to cover that. So my question is, I still don't know if I actually understand or agree with that. My question is, why in this amendment have we added under 8.2.2.2 number E, development complements the role of an airport as an economic freight and logistics hub and enhance the economic opportunities that are available in proximity to an airport. Why was that an included addition, but including local general aviation is not?
Through you, Mr Chair. Probably a couple of things that are worth saying. The first one is that the role of these overlay codes is to mitigate impacts of the airport, or provide those safety elements associated with the operation of the airport. It's not strictly to set out the intent for what the airport's used for. That's kind of covered in more detail and more appropriately as part of that local plan code. my understanding is that the additional wording that's incorporated reflects the state interest matters relating to a statement that they have in the state code around what they refer to as strategic state significant airports. So from our perspective, we probably don't think that statement is necessary either, but it is consistent with state planning policy. And we felt that the issues that you had raised, Councillor, about the local businesses and aviation activities out there would have much more effect in the local plan code and in the appropriate play of the new planning scheme, because people aren't looking at the overlay code in terms of understanding what the intent of the airport is. They're only looking at the airport overlay code to understand what the impacts are upon development outside of the airport generally, in terms of obstacle limitation surfaces, safety areas, etc., if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. That does make sense, because I couldn't understand why it was included either if we're just talking about airport operations or safety. But I guess a concern that I have or a fear is that the airport may undergo that priority development area process, and would not this overlay or this section here be considered in any decision making made by the state government in terms of any applications that come through?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Look, certainly the state, so essentially because the state planning policy has already been changed, it overrides our planning scheme, and it generally overrides any other planning instrument as well. It's like the highest order level of planning instrument. So what we're doing in this planning scheme amendment is just reflecting what is already in state planning policy and actually is required to be considered as part of any development application, whether it's a development application made under the scheme or through some other format. There will need to be thought given to when a development scheme is prepared for the airport, in particular about how those overlays continue to have effect, because it's an unusual situation. You don't normally get a PDA, because normally they're cutouts from the planning scheme, but in this case we've got these state and important local planning controls that need to continue to have effect within that PDA.
I guess so then my final question on that particular matter is that the Maroochy North Shore Local Plan Code and this planning scheme amendment provides no guarantee for the local general aviation industry or of any protection, because the PDA overrides both of those plans. Through you, Mr. Chair, once again, look, ultimately, I think it's important to say that the development scheme that's prepared for the PDA will be something that the council will have an involvement in. So, making sure that concept is appropriately reflected is something that council might want to consider once the development scheme is before it for consideration. Okay, thank you. I'll take that offline to follow up when that comes to that time. The second area that I wanted to discuss in terms of this area of the proposed planning scheme amendments is a result of an email that I received only yesterday, so apologies for the short notice. And it's just in relation to the flight paths, and I understand that this has got nothing to do with the flight paths, but just to get that information and understanding out there to the general public, I ask the following questions. So what would be, Air Services Australia are undertaking a post-implementation review of the flight paths, and the community have made, a number of community groups have made various submissions on that. What would be the impact of this planning scheme review on Air Services post-implementation review?
Through you, Mr. Chair, this amendment should have no effect on that review, because all it's doing is reflecting the state planning policy mapping that's been updated.
Thank you. What impact would there be on residents if this airport environs overlay code, which reflects the current operations at the airport, was not to be adopted? And I ask that question in the frame of criticism that this council received from not having updated flight path information in our overlay codes, and people purchasing property and not being aware that they were overflowing. So in relation to that context, what would be the impact on our residents if this was not to be adopted? Through you, Mr. Chair, look, I think the airport is such a significant piece of infrastructure with
with obvious impacts external to it, that it's important that our planning scheme is as up to date as possible as explaining those impacts. Whilst the state planning policy already incorporates that mapping and therefore it has effect in law, a lot of people aren't putting the state planning policy together with the planning scheme, which is why we thought it was important to make sure that it's now reflected in the planning scheme as soon as practicable.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you there. So then my final question on that is why were these overlays that reflect the current flight path and noise areas not adopted at the previous planning scheme review? Why has it taken us this long to put them in?
Through you, Mr. Chair, once again, the resolution of a number of these layers is only a fairly recent addition. So I think 2020 or 2021 that they've actually come into the state planning policy. Before then, the planning scheme, I think, continues to have sort of older, has both flight paths and not quite the right alignment. So this scheme amendment's just trying to give effect to that state planning policy change that happened in 2020 and 2021. We would like for it to have come forward to council sooner, but a bit like at the airport, landing scheme amendments is a bit like landing planes, and you've got to sort of stack them and rack them and get them in the right order.
Okay, thank you. I'll speak to the motion if I may. Thank you for this, and just wanted to give some clarification. I also spoke to the Pedestrian Family and Friends Association about the amendment for Pedestrian, and they're quite satisfied with that. But I'm sure once public consultation comes out, we'll hear more of a debate. But at the moment, I have comfort with the planning scheme amendment that is in Division 9. I will be supporting the alternative motion because I don't think the amount of work is a rationale for not supporting it, and I also believe that Councillor Natoli should be able to reflect his community's wishes in terms of these amendments. There will be consultation that will occur if this package goes through to the Minister, which allows both sides, the residents and any of the personal landowners, to put their interests forward. And then we also have the opportunity with the planning scheme review down the track for the broader area to be addressed. But in the meantime, this provides some additional safeguards to the community, and that's why I'll be supporting it today.
Thank you, Councillor Suarez. Councillor Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Acting, Mr. Deputy Chairman. Deputy Mayor, I suppose you are, aren't you? Even though you're in the chair today. I want to address the Woombye rezoning. This is within the urban corridor for the SEQ plan area, and it's already built upon, and it's just regulating the situation that's on the ground, and I support that very strongly. In fact, I've been asking about it for ever since the earlier developments occurred. In relation to the motion as it stands at the present moment, I'll be supporting the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnston. Councillor Hungerford, and I acknowledge that, Councillor Hungerford, because we've now clarified this is talking to the resolution in total, you may wish to ask further questions or speak to it further, and as the Chair, I'm happy for you to do so.
Yeah, because I was confused before on what you were speaking of. First of all, a question. This is site-specific and editorial matters, which means minor amendments and more reflecting what's happening in site-specific areas to reflect development that's happened there or what's happening in that area. So would the, including, because we currently got the southern area of the Buddina urban village and it's on site-specific, but by taking that whole northern section would mean it's a whole precinct. Would it be fair to say that would be more a major amendment than a minor site-specific one?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't think that change would be of a different character to some other changes that are proposed as part of this amendment. Probably the only difference, there are proposals, for example, in the amendment to increase some heights. This would be, as I recall, the only proposal in the scheme amendment is currently contained to decrease heights. But I think its general scale would not be inconsistent with some of the other amendments that are incorporated.
Well, probably because I've got sites in my area that I was going to speak to, but before I was speaking to it, I was only speaking to the amendment.
Yep.
Christian touched on some of those.
Councillor Hungerford has already spoken to the motion.
And I, as the Chair, I've already recognised that. The impression given was that you were addressing only the red part of the resolution, and we've clarified that is broader now, the whole resolution, so I'm allowing him to re-argue, because he thought he was only addressing the amendment part of the resolution.
Well, I personally, as someone who's been in the role one term of halfway through, I knew what was going on. I asked my questions appropriately. I'm astonished that a councillor of Councillor Hungerford's experience was not aware of what was happening and what motion we were talking to. I'm baffled.
Noted. Thank you very much, Councillor Hungerford. Carry on.
Thank you. 5 of the 13 amendments are in Division 7. I've got the lion's share of amendments out of all the divisions. 4 of those 5 were previously in Councillor Dixon's area, and we've spoken on a lot of these before, so I was just going to address some of those. Christian's already had the Power Road to Goshawk link. That's a very important road link coming up, and what this amendment does is it clarifies the zoning, but more accurately, the bushland to the north ensures that that's preserved. There's been a lot of clearing down there and a lot of angst with the residents of how much of the vegetation's been lost, and this is about securing that and ensuring that vegetation stays. The Joel Court, that's where we've had a lot of medium density, a lot of unit development there. Residents now on that northern sector have been in the rural zoning, so the two right next to each other don't really reflect. This is about giving a transition in that area, in their planning scheme, which has been lacking before. Laverick Crescent, now this was a good one. Christian and I met on this one with proponents of the service station. We didn't have an objection to what they were doing, but because if we had have allowed that, it would have caused a precedent in the planning precinct, which would have been a precedent that could be detrimental to our further applications we receive on a similar thing in other areas. The proper planning intent is to amend your zoning, to amend your town plan in the first instance, and not create those precedents which are a cancer against your town plans, proper planning. And I'm quite pleased to bring that forward because I did have empathy for the owners there and what they were doing, but we've got to get the planning intent correct and not create precedents that affect the town planning in the future and the community in other areas. And the other one is Dixon Road. We've had a lot of discussion on that one, the amount that land there being in a limited development zone and all around it wasn't. It had residential. So to give that a bit more context there makes sense for that land holding. And we both had empathy there. People come forward with these things, you've got to change your town plan in the first instance, make those amendments. That's being responsible and proper planning, and that's what we're doing with these. The rest of them are only minor. Different councillors get that input there, but I believe if there's any other things council are looking at, the new town plan is the place to prosecute your cases where there's other intents there, so it can be given a proper planning context and for the other councillors to see that as well. I strongly urge councillors to look at those plans when we have amendments and town plans and things. Put your best case forward. Do not come to meetings with alternates and amendments on the floor of council after the work. That work should have been done a lot earlier in that amendment process and looking at changes to the town plan. That's where the work's done, not by motions on the floor of council here at the 11th hour. That is the wrong way to do planning. Thank you, and I will not be supporting this amendment, and should it not get up, I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Hungerford. Councillor Dixon, I'll offer you the same courtesy.
Oh, no, I fully understood where we were, and I talked on everything. But I can understand how people would have perceived the differences. Question through to Mr. Patey. I know this has been asked. I just want to ask again, because I can vote however I want. Ultimately, I'm responsible to the community, and they can judge me at the election. Given that there's an appetite in the room that I'm reading, read it wrong, that councillors are willing to proceed on major planning changes in the urban village because it's a large area. It's not just a site-specific amendment. which was my hesitancy. If I vote with Councillor Natoli today and we move down the route to proceed with the whole urban village in a sense, because that's what the petitioners want, they want the whole precinct reviewed, are you confident that we can do this? And it's not about time, it's not about resources, none of that concerns me. It's just about the proper due process to the community to fully understand what we're embarking on today. If you're confident, I can be confident. Just please give me some confidence.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm confident that if it's Council's mind to incorporate the proposed amendment that would allow for this site to be also dealt with, that we'll deal with that efficiently and effectively as part of the planning scheme amendment process. I would say that it's quite possible that if the amendment was to proceed and ultimately take effect, it might be that we still need to revisit issues in the urban village and make further changes as part of the new planning scheme, but those matters would be considered in the fullness of time.
Again, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this. Would you find it beneficial to get the process underway now? We're going to do the work anyway. It's going to come to us. Are you finding that any decision to move forward, we're just bringing forward the inevitable? Work's going to happen. Might as well start it now. It just gives the community some assurance and focus that this is picked up. We are aware of it, and we made that decision today.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I certainly acknowledge that the amended motion responds to what has been local community's concern that's been expressed to us. We naturally are conservative in terms of amendments to the planning scheme because we don't want to give impressions of things that can't be delivered ultimately. If these matters are going to be dealt with in the scheme, I can also see the benefit of addressing it now. So,
happy with that, Councillor Dixon? Okay. Councillor Law.
Thank you. Through you, Deputy Mayor. I just have a question, please, if I may. Councillor O'Prey, you mentioned and you've stood and spoken to the amendment around Ocean Street. How long ago did you start that work with the officers to arrive today with that amendment being considered, roughly?
Yeah, so, Councillor Law, in regard to the amount of time that it's taken, the lead up to creating the entire entertainment precinct in and around Ocean Street was a long, drawn-out project. That took many years and was one that I was very supportive of. What we've found post the acknowledgement of the proposal and the putting it into the planning scheme process was that there was a number of residential housing, unit dwellings that were inside the precinct. And over time, and it's been over time, and the time the question, to answer your question, the time was probably around about 12 months to 18 months ago that people started to arc up about it. So they've been in the process for a while. I'm fully supportive of that. There's two units there. There's Pier 10 and there's Riverside that are overwhelmingly occupied by residents, both holiday residents and permanent residents. There was a hotel, there was a restaurant underneath, and that wasn't there for a very long time. The community are worried about what can happen with an entertainment precinct, which means nightclubs. Nightclubs go to 3 a.m, sometimes you can get extensions even past that. That's really where the issue lies within the residency. They don't want to see any opportunity of having a nightclub downstairs, and I get that. Not really reality, and they all acknowledge that, but it is able to be done. And I've taken that on board. We've corrected our ways, and that's what's happened today. So I'd say to you, and answer your question, somewhere between 12 and 18 months.
Great, thank you. And Councillor Ted, if I may, same question. You mentioned that you've got 7 or 8 of these amendments. How long have you been working on, what would have been the oldest one here that you've been working on to arrive at this amendment today?
A lot of them average 2 to 3 years. Probably 4 ones we've been discussing on, so what you've got to do is do the work in the lead up to it. And I've been doing these for years, working through there, and that's how it should be done. Not by resolutions here, amending things at the 11th hour.
Thank you.
That is not how you do sound planning.
And Councillor Dixon, same question. So obviously one of them you've worked on with your colleague for years. Is there any that you've been working on even longer than that?
Not particularly in this package. With fairness, I think Councillor Ted's inherited them, but yeah, probably the service station one in Buddina, because just a bit of context. I think the resident was wanting to lodge a DA and just have everything done through a development application, and Councillor Hungerford and I just made it clear that's probably not the best idea. So it's taken, I think, 3 or 4 years since he put some interest in. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. And I'm not sure who can answer this question. It might be Councillor Joe. How long are you aware of the community wanting these changes in Buddina?
I first became aware of this during the election campaign when I was door knocking, and I did door knock the entire Buddina area, not just the village area, but the entire Buddina area.
Okay. So, we've heard some arguments. I think we should be supporting this.
I'll take that as a question. Lovely, thank you. Councillor Hungerford.
Well, a follow-up on there on Councillor Natoli's answer. He was just brought to his attention in elections in 2020. We've done workshops on this leading up to here. Why didn't he push this case during those workshops?
He may address that in his closing argument. Are there any other questions or comments, councillors? Did you want to address it in your close?
Just a question.
A question.
Just for clarity, there's 2 parts, the southern and the northern. My understanding is that in the past, they may have been coloured differently, there may have been different heights. Can you just elaborate on that, just for clarity?
There are, through you, Mr Chair, there are, within the Buddina urban village, there are a number of different zones. So there's the medium density residential zone, the high density residential zone, and the one other zone, which is the tourist accommodation zone, escapes me momentarily. There is also a number of different height limits, depending on which part of the urban village that you're in. Those provisions generally haven't changed historically. They were brought in by the former Caloundra City Council as, I think, part of Caloundra City Plan, or even before that. So, and they've existed largely unchanged. The height limits in this particular, talking to the southern area, generally is 12 metres, and then the central and northern areas, you've got the 21 metre height limit, as I recall.
My understanding is at one point the northern area was marked blue as medium density, but then was changed back to high density.
Through you, Mr Chair, look, I'd probably have to take that question on notice, Councillor. It might be a bit of a history around the transition of planning schemes, what was in Caloundra City Plan, how that transitioned into the current scheme. I'm not particularly aware of that change, but I'm not saying it didn't happen.
Happy with that, Councillor Natoli. Before I go to your close, no other questions or comments, if I may, I'd like to ask a question, Mr Patey. Just given that you made a comment that this is the only amendment that would effectively be a down zone, if I heard that correctly, could you again just explain what the risk to council being around that being to some extent a different signal or a different principle? Would you address that for us, please?
Yeah, certainly, Mr Chair. Look, there's no specific risk in terms of a legal risk to council, because planning schemes are changed all the time, and where development entitlements are reduced, there's a process under legislation whereby people can lodge an application under a superseded scheme and take advantage of the rights that are afforded to them. Council always needs to be mindful, I think, of amending the scheme where, and I'm sure council is, when reducing development entitlements, just around the different stakeholders and the certainty that different parties need in terms of making investment decisions around the purchase and development of land, and that's certainly one factor in any scheme amendment change that we make. It's just being conscious that we send signals to the community and also to other stakeholders as well as part of these processes. But there's no substantive legal risk. I think the biggest risk that I perceive is one whereby an amendment occurs and takes effect, but actually development occurs in accordance with the current entitlements. And that's really just a managing a process with the community that there's not a perception that an amendment now or as part of the new scheme will necessarily deliver a different outcome to the one that's currently provided for in the current scheme, because there's a whole process to work through where people will need, that those rights need to be extinguished.
Thank you for that. Can I just check that that wasn't a key part of the decision or the assessment that you guys made to make sure that this was considered as part of the planning scheme review and not an amendment process? Because you did say that you were aware of it and you'd left this essentially for a later process, a larger process.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, once again, the decision to deal with it as part of the new planning scheme, or the proposal to deal with the part of the new planning scheme, was just a recognition that there might be a number of changes required throughout the Kawana area, and to deal with all of those as one process. And also, although we had a petition dealing with part of the urban village, we were also mindful that there might be other changes that are warranted or appropriate in there, but we didn't want to bring those forward at this time. We'd also, as part of the new planning scheme project, sort of resolved or identified a key direction about reviewing height limits. I think that's how it's framed, as a local planning direction for Kawana, and I guess we were keen to see what the feedback that might be, whether it's consistent with what the petition says. Presumably it is, but I guess that was a very substantive community engagement process where we sought that feedback. So that were really the rationale behind. And there were a couple of things that happened. So we started this amendment process perhaps before Council resolved to prepare a new scheme, and then subsequently discussed key policy directions. So as I said, it's a little bit awkward. We get some things crossing over each other.
No, look, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So, councillors, if there's no other questions, comments, Councillor Matoli to close.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Just to answer the question that Councillor Hungerford brought up, this did come through a workshop, and I'm confident that there were significant hands that went up that supported the petition and request of the residents to reduce the height in the northern precinct from 21 metres to 12 metres, and to change the density from high density to medium density. So it has gone through that process. The difficulty for me is that it is a confidential process that we have to go through. I can't go out to the community and start engaging with the community about something that is a confidential process that we take through. And that's the problem, I suppose, with the planning scheme amendments, is that we don't have that ability to be able to go out and do the elaborate work that we do through the main planning process. But honestly, during that election campaign, just about everyone that I engaged in Buddina wanted to talk about the height and the building. Scaffolding was up, and it was very, very much on everybody's agenda. And I think most of the community wanted council to deal with it. And it's not just a handful of people. I would say virtually everyone. I didn't speak to one person that actually supported it. Didn't speak to one that supported it. So, for me, I think yesterday morning all of the councillors received a letter that was sent to us from Sharon Hyde at 701, and they represent residents who live in the northern precinct, and there's 18 signatures that they're saying that they want council not to support the councillor, the recommendation the officer room, but they want to support the inclusion of the northern precinct to reduce the height to 12 metres and to also bring the density back from high to medium. If we only deal with half of this now, and we say to the community, we're only going to take one part and we're not going to take the other part, I just think it's a really hard argument to be able to say, well, we're prepared to consider this. And in fact, the feedback that I've had in the last few days has been, if that's what council wants to do, then withdraw the Buddina Urban Village altogether. Don't deal with the southern part in separate to the northern. The petition asks for both, not the southern, not the northern, but for both as one. And to disregard that, I think for a community that it's been a major issue for them, then I think, as I said, it's a sign of good faith for us to be able to show them that we're listening, prepared to act, and not allow this to continue to be a source of frustration in that community. And I think there'd be a real concern if we don't deal with this height issue and density issues here. There is a forecast to be significant change in the planning scheme in my division, and I think that will start to send a different signal to those communities. So I think if the council was prepared to support the motion that I put up today, then I think that, as I said, as a sign of good faith, the community will look at this council and say they're at least prepared to support the community and listen to the community, and that gives them a chance through the planning scheme process to have faith that council's going to do the same then. When I was elected in '97, we dropped the height in Coolum to 3 stories, and eventually had dropped the height in Alex in certain parts to 3 stories. They were all done through planning scheme amendments. They used the superseded planning scheme, they use it or lose the provisions that are in there, and we've managed to do that. And it is a process when the community is sending us a strong signal that they do not agree with the current planning provisions. It is a process that we can go through, and I think all we're going to do is delay the inevitable. If there's going to be work now, it's going to be work back in 2 years' time when we deal with through the planning scheme process. It's not going to reduce. The community there's not going to let up. They've kept that pressure on before and during this term, and I would hope that we could just bed it down, give them the sense of relief that they know that the council's at least listening to them. So, councillors, I urge you, please listen to the community. I've done that for all councillors that have brought forward their concerns of the community. I want to hear from those councillors about the concerns of the communities, and I've voted in support of those communities and decision of that council to support that. And I think it's an appropriate process for us to do that for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Natoli. Councillor, just to make absolutely sure, you're now considering 8.3, the alternative motion, as on the screen, moved by Councillor Natoli, seconded by Councillor Dixon. I'll ask you to vote. Those in favour of the alternative motion. Councillor Natoli, Councillor Dixon, Councillor Suarez, Councillor Law, and Councillor Johnston. Those against? Councillor Hungerford, Councillor Pratt, Councillor Babarowski, and Councillor Landsberg. I think you guys have it. The motion is passed. Congratulations. Councillors, I think I'd like to thank you for your patience and endurance in that item. It may signal to the CEO that we might need to clarify, use this as a bit of a case study, and clarify for the councillors, further clarify for the councillors exactly what the ideal process would be. There sometimes isn't an ideal process, but perhaps it might be useful for us to review this as a case study so people are more confident on when to speak to what item. So thank you very much for that, councillors. We'll now move on to item... No, we won't. We'll take a tea break, and that gives the Mayor a chance to resume the chair. So we'll have 10 minutes. 10 minutes for tea.
Councillors, will resume our meeting, and we are up to item 8.4, which is the Queensland Audit Office first interim management report for the financial year ended 30 June 2022. And I invite Janine Wex to give us a presentation. Thanks, Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. So I'm here to present our first interim report from the Queensland Audit Office. Now, as you know, our annual financial statements are audited by the Queensland Audit Office every year. You can see on the screen there that they visit us 5 times a year. So this was their second visit, called the Interim Audit, and it was conducted in March. After they go through all their visits, we'll get our audit opinion in October 2022. And every year, the Auditor General reports on the results of local government audits in his annual report to Parliament. So the first interim report looks at the period July 21 to February 22, and in particular it looks at the design and implementation of Council's key controls and systems to ensure that they can rely on them in terms of auditing the financial statements. Now, after extensive testing, QAO have determined that Council's internal control environment does support an audit strategy that can rely on these controls, and where issues have been identified, which I'll go into, they'll undertake additional substantive testing to gain comfort over those transactions. So they've identified 4 issues as part of this first interim audit. 3 of them were resolved straight away, and the third one requires a system configuration. So the auditors will check on these issues at a further visit. There are also 3 prior year issues that are still in progress. These are due at the 30th of June. They're on track. As part of their audit, they also look at areas of particular audit focus. Now, these are items by their size or complexity that could pose a risk to the financial statements, and they consist of the valuation of our assets. It's such a big number, and because a lot of our assets don't have a market value we can obtain, like we can't find out how much to buy a road or some stormwater, there's a lot of estimation involved in terms of the useful life of these assets and the unit rates that we're using to value them. They also look at the revenue recognition of our infrastructure charges and our contributed assets. They're in particular concerned about the timing of those. They look at our occurrence and appropriateness of procurement, the valuation of our investment in Unity Water, and also the accounting we do for any major projects and transactions. And we always do have some major projects. At this stage, everything is on track in terms of the areas of audit focus. Most of them will be checked more thoroughly at year end, and that's in particular the valuation of our investment in Unity Water and the valuation of our infrastructure assets. So Council will return to, QAO will return to Council in June to conduct the second interim audit, in July to look at our asset valuations, and then in September to conduct their final audit of the statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Happy to move. Councillor Hungerford, thank you. Seconded, Councillor Natali, thank you. Would you like to open, Councillor Hungerford?
Through you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to point out this council has consistently received an unmodified audit option. What's that, 12, 13 years in a row now?
I think it's 13.
13, I think we've got to now. The highest accolade you can get in the county, we've got 13 years in a row. Now this one here shows the strength of the Queensland Audit Office overlooking us and our Audit Committee in identifying issues. And as been pointed out here, there were 4 potential weaknesses. There hasn't been any actual problems with it. It's just these are identified as potential weaknesses that could cause an issue in the future. I think it's proactive and shows the effectiveness of our Audit Committee and the Queensland Audit Office overseeing us because it keeps us on our toes. And I think that's an excellent thing. The first one is a weakness in security settings, user access privileges. That's resolved pending audit clearance. A potential weakness in security over electronic funds payment data, user access privileges. That one's in progress because there's a whole system has to be built around that. And that work, I believe, is looking at being completed by the 30th of June from memory.
Some of it by the 30th of June through you, Mr Chair, and most of it by November.
Correct. So we already have timelines and we're completing those processes. We've got to build a whole new process. The other one is untimely review of the fixed asset register reconciliation to the general ledger. That's been resolved, pending audit clearance. And a potential inconsistency of control details between contract register and Council's website. Again, resolved, pending audit clearance. In addition, there were 3 prior deficiencies due for resolution by the 30th of June 2020. These are all in progress. So it shows we're right on top of it all, but it is healthy to have these identified and then look at how you improve the systems before you get an actual problem. And I think that's excellent that we're open to doing that, reviewing ourselves, looking for potential problems and fixing them. Our audit committee, well, I know because I sit on that one with Councillor Natoli, these things come through and then the different areas of council get to look at what that is and what the potential for that risk is, and then how do we mitigate that risk. I think this shows that this council is right on top of its game. We shouldn't be afraid of publicly acknowledging these, because this is about us being proactive and dealing with potential risks before they become an actual problem. And I think that's a great thing, and we shouldn't be afraid of sharing this with the community because we're doing this work in their interest. The finance team, you're in those meetings, and there's a lot of excellent work done there, and working with those different areas in council to come up with those new systems. I think we should be proud of this, and we should be actually confident of taking this out to our community, because it's about us showing transparency, openness and accountability. And that's something I'd like to see us continue into the future. So I'll put this to you. This is an excellent report and excellent for council to take out to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hungerford. Councillor Babarowski.
Well, thank you, Mr Mayor. I just wanted to some extent, reinforce what Councillor Hungerford was saying, and just acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of people involved in this process, and I, for one, having been councillor for just over 10 years, have always appreciated the fact that this is quite a difficult and complex area to get your head around. So I really appreciate the two portfolio councillors and their involvement, and the committee and the staff for essentially being able to deliver such solid results that the community, I'm sure, are really reassured by. One observation I make is that it's a very continuous process, isn't it? It's not like there's 1 month in the year and it's all heads down and it happens. As your comments pointed out, it's virtually all the time a different aspect of it gets reviewed. So would you basically agree that the community can be reassured that there is no one hit, it's almost a continuous process, and then you just go back to the beginning?
Through you, Mr Chair, absolutely. In fact, the interim audit went for 6 weeks instead of 2, so they're very, very thorough, and it's continuous, and we're always in contact with the Queensland Audit Office. Any issues that come up, we talk to them straight away. Anything that's quite substantial or unusual, which council does have a lot of, we're always in contact with them. They almost could move in, really.
Okay, no further speakers. Put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Sorry, I got Winston, you're up as well. Thank you. Let's go to item 10. Thank you, Janine. Item 10.1 is a petition from Councillor Natoli.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to table a petition, and I'll read that the prayer. We, the undersigned, respectfully petition Sunshine Council to install crossings/gutter ramp signage on road directly in front of the Hedge by Bermagui, Crescent, Buddina for safety of residents crossing to the Queensland Shopping Centre. There's 71 signatures, total 5 pages. I can table that.
Okay, moved by Councillor Natoli, seconded by Councillor Suarez. All those in favour of receipt? That's carried unanimously. Put your hand up, Councillor Johnston. Thank you. That motion's carried, or that petition is received. Councillors, before we go into confidential session, do any of you wish to declare any personal interest in relation to the item to be discussed? If this is the case, you'll also be required to declare any personal interest when council resumes open session to make a decision on this item. In relation to item 11.1, the Chief Executive Officer advises that the report contains confidential information which should be considered and discussed in a closed session of the council meeting in accordance with section 254J bracket 3 brackets G of the Local Government Regulation 2012, as the report contains information relating to negotiations relating to a commercial matter involving the local government, which a public discussion would be likely to prejudice the interests of the local government. For these reasons, it has been recommended that Council close the meeting under section 254J bracket 3 brackets G of the Local Government Act 2012 to consider and discuss the information in these reports. Noting, of course, that Council's decision on this agenda item will be made during open session and be viewable by the public. So is someone prepared to move? We go into closed session, please. Councillor Suarez, thank you. And the seconder, Councillor Natoli, thank you. All those in favour? Terry, thank you. That's carried unanimously. Okay, we're back in open session. Councillor Johnston's indicated he's prepared to move the officer recommendation, and he'd be seconded by Councillor Suarez. Councillor Johnston, is there anything you'd like to say?
Only, Mr Mayor, to congratulate Dr David and his team for acquiring or proposing the acquisition of this property. It's an important part of an overall scheme, and is the last missing bit between the Kirby Road Environmental Reserve, which we already own, plus the Conalula National Park and the Maloney National Park. And it was just that portion of land that was fits into the jigsaw. So they're to be congratulated, and I encourage all councillors to support it.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further speakers? Councillor Suarez.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I was happy to support the Regional Councillor on this item. It does relate to my portfolio, and it will deliver on the corporate plan goal of environment and livability, and deliver on a number of actions underneath that goal. So I encourage my fellow councillors to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Suarez. No further speakers. We'll put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you to David and the team. Councillors, that brings us to the end of today's meeting, so we'll close it at 11:30.